Lyon in the dead of winter was a city of contrasts, where the icy grip of December met the fiery chaos of human celebration. The streets were lined with flickering lanterns, their light bouncing off the cobblestones slick with melting snow. Merchants called out their wares in hoarse voices, while the aroma of roasted chestnuts and spiced wine mingled with the acrid smoke of chimneys. This was the season of Carnival, a brief window when masks and laughter allowed the rigid social orders to dissolve, if only for a few stolen hours. The city seemed alive, breathing with a rhythm that was both intoxicating and deceptive. For the nobles, it was a time of indulgence and excess. They adorned themselves in silks and velvets, their masks glittering with gold leaf, feathers, and jewels, strutting through the streets with the air of untouchable divinity. Music poured from the open windows of grand townhouses, the melodies of violins and flutes weaving a spell over the revelers. Balls were held in vast halls, their floors polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the movement of dancers who twirled beneath chandeliers dripping with candlelight. Every laugh, every clink of glass, every whispered flirtation seemed to carry the promise of magic, freedom, and reckless abandon. But beneath this veneer of gaiety, the city harbored shadows. The same streets that glittered with light were also paths of suffering for those who labored unseen. The servants of Lyon's elite moved silently among the massed crowds, their faces hidden beneath modest masks that could not disguise the lines of exhaustion, anxiety, and resentment. They were the invisible heartbeat of the city, sweeping, cooking, cleaning, attending, and obeying. Their work was relentless, yet their lives were governed by the whims of their masters. Every command, every insult, every demeaning gesture etched itself into their minds like invisible scars. The nobles celebrated, unaware of the mounting frustration, the simmering anger that lingered in the servants' hearts like a low, constant drumbeat, a rhythm that would grow louder and more insistent with every passing day of neglect and abuse. The carnival itself became a paradox. Masks allowed the rich to escape the judgment of society, yet they also served as instruments of psychological torment for those who served them. The servants could witness indulgence they would never taste, laughter they were forbidden to join, and decadence they could only observe. The air was thick with irony, for the very festival meant to unite the city in joy and merriment amplified the divisions that lay just beneath the surface. In grand parlors, nobles danced without thought, while just beyond the threshold, those who kept the balls running silently cursed their masters, dreaming, perhaps unconsciously, of a world turned upside down. The tension between light and shadow was palpable, and in the undercurrent of festivity, a darker story began to stir, one that would erupt with sudden, shocking violence. No one could have predicted that this carnival would be different. The streets were filled with masks and laughter, yet beneath the celebration, seeds of revenge were quietly germinating. In the kitchens, in the servants' quarters, in hidden corners of the grand houses, whispered conversations hinted at impossible dreams. Servants spoke of justice, of payback, of righting wrongs long endured in silence. The air smelled of fear, opportunity, and something far more dangerous, hope transformed into hatred. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the lanterns cast longer shadows, and the city seemed to hold its breath. The music from the squares swelled and mingled with the murmur of plotting, creating a haunting symphony that few could sense, but many would ultimately feel. There was a tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm that no one saw coming until it broke. The nobility, drunk on wine and self-importance, never suspected that the joy surrounding them was a fragile illusion. They laughed at masked strangers in the street, toasted friends with an easy confidence, and swept through the carnival like gods among mortals. Their faces were painted, their bodies adorned, yet none of their decorations could protect them from the reality waiting in their own homes. Outside, the cold bit at the heels of those who had no place to enter the gilded halls. Inside, the servants observed, planning, and calculating. Every moment of laughter, every flash of candlelight on velvet and satin, deepened the contrast between the two worlds. This was a city divided not just by wealth, but by a simmering resentment that had festered for years. And as the night progressed, the tension between privilege and oppression, light and shadow, indulgence and despair, reached a point where it could no longer be contained. By midnight, Lyon had become a city poised on a knife's edge. The carnival was at its peak. The streets thronged with people, music filled the air, and the nobles were lost in their revelry. Masks concealed identities, but the intentions hidden behind them were far more telling than the painted faces. In the servants' quarters, whispered instructions passed from one conspirator to another. Each knew their role, each had waited for this moment, and each carried within them the weight of countless slights endured over years. The night air, heavy with the scent of smoke, wine, and human expectation, carried the promise of something terrible. What began as a celebration of life, color, and freedom would, in mere hours, be transformed into a tale of blood, betrayal, and unthinkable violence. The city of Lyon, unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold within its walls, danced on the cusp of horror. This was the shadow behind the carnival, a darkness that no mask could hide, a storm that would leave no household untouched. It was a night when joy would collide with vengeance, where laughter would be replaced by screams, and where the fine line between servitude and rebellion would be shattered forever. The midnight massacre, though yet unseen, had already begun in the minds and hearts of those who had long suffered in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Lyon was about to witness a darkness that would be remembered for centuries, a reminder that even in the most radiant celebrations, shadows can grow, and the most invisible among us may carry the deadliest intentions. Lyon's streets were alive with color and music, but beyond the public squares and glittering halls lay a world few outsiders ever glimpsed. Behind every opulent mansion, beneath the carved wooden doors and polished stone staircases, servants moved silently, invisible yet indispensable. They were the lifeblood of noble households, the hidden cogs in a machine of indulgence and excess. Each day was a relentless cycle of labor, fetching water, stoking fires, cleaning floors, preparing lavish meals, serving wine, and attending to whims that ranged from the harmlessly eccentric to the cruelly capricious. Their lives were dictated by schedules that did not allow rest, and their identities were often reduced to titles like cook, valet, or maid. Many of these workers had known no other existence, born into servitude, raised within walls of privilege they would never touch. Their knowledge of the nobles' habits, secrets, and vulnerabilities gave them an intimate power they could never openly exercise, yet it simmered quietly, like a river trapped behind a dam, pressing against the limits of its containment. The nobles themselves were a study in contradictions. They presented an image of refinement, elegance, and authority, but beneath the silks and velvets, many were petty, cruel, and indulgent to the point of moral decay. Balls, feasts, and masquerades were not merely celebrations, but demonstrations of power, spectacles designed to reinforce their social dominance. They spent fortunes on art, clothing, and jewel-encrusted accessories, flaunting wealth that the city's majority could only dream of. Yet their extravagance was often paired with disdain for those who maintained it. A servant might be punished for a minor mistake, humiliated for a misplaced tray, or berated for failing to anticipate a whim. Small cruelties, seemingly insignificant in isolation, accumulated into an oppressive atmosphere where every action, every glance, every word reminded the servants of their subordinate place in the world. Life in Lyon was defined by this constant contrast, the opulent, indulgent, carefree existence of the few and the laborious, constrained, and often fearful existence of the many. Servants saw the inner workings of their masters' households, the arguments, the secret debts, the clandestine affairs, but rarely had the means or the courage to intervene. They were witnesses to sins and scandals, guardians of private knowledge, yet utterly powerless to alter the course of events. Their world was one of observation, anticipation, and survival. Some found ways to exert minor influence, slight delays, small sabotage, whispered gossip, but these were fleeting victories, temporary relief in a life otherwise defined by strict rules and harsh punishment. The weight of their subjugation, combined with a growing awareness of injustice, created a fertile ground for resentment. simmering just beneath the surface of daily obedience. The psychological toll was profound. Servants were forced to navigate an existence where obedience was necessary for survival, but compliance exacted a subtle, constant erosion of self. They learned to hide emotions, mask their anger, and suppress natural reactions. Every word of protest risked humiliation. Every glance of defiance could lead to dismissal, or worse, physical punishment. Yet this suppression of self intensified internal pressure. Anger and frustration accumulated invisibly, transforming into a private, internalized fire. For some, it became an obsession with justice or revenge, a fantasy of overturning the social order that had dictated their misery for so long. These thoughts were dangerous, of course, but they were also the only emotional refuge for those trapped in a rigid, hierarchical system that denied dignity, recognition, or basic humanity. Economically, the divide between the servants and their masters was stark. Many servants lived in cramped quarters above stables or kitchens, enduring freezing winters, leaky roofs, and minimal sustenance. Even those who had been in service for years had little opportunity for upward mobility. Wages were meager, often supplemented only by tips or leftovers, and savings were impossible for most. Contrast this with the nobles, who spent freely on silk, wine, and feasts, seemingly oblivious to the grinding poverty beneath their own roofs. This disparity fostered an acute sense of injustice, magnifying every slight and deepening the emotional gulf between classes. Servants could see, in the most literal sense, what life could be if the system were different, and the knowledge became both a torment and a temptation. Beyond economics and psychology, the cultural norms of Lyon reinforced obedience while subtly humiliating the lower classes. Servants were expected to participate in household rituals and festivals, yet only as shadows, never as participants. They prepared costumes for balls, polished masks, and arranged rooms for celebrations they could not enjoy. Their labor enabled others to experience joy, while they remained constrained, isolated, and unacknowledged. Even during Carnival, a festival of inversion and revelry, the lower classes could participate only within tightly controlled limits. Their joy permitted only insofar as it did not threaten the appearance of social hierarchy. The city itself became a mirror, reflecting privilege and deprivation side by side, a visual and emotional reminder of the chasm between the masters and those who served them. Within this hidden world, resentment brewed quietly, almost imperceptibly. Small acts of defiance, whispered complaints, and furtive glances at the grandeur surrounding them were the seeds of something far more dangerous. Each injustice suffered, each insult endured, each humiliation observed added fuel to a fire that, while dormant, was never truly extinguished. The servants' knowledge of the nobles' vulnerabilities, combined with their intimate access to the inner workings of the households, created the potential for catastrophe, a potential that would soon be realized in the most shocking and violent way imaginable. The contrast between public celebration and private suffering, between visible joy and hidden torment, set the stage for a confrontation that Lyon would never forget. In the shadows of Lyon's grand mansions, the seeds of revenge quietly took root. Servants who had spent years enduring ridicule, abuse, and relentless labor began to share whispered conversations behind closed doors, in attics, kitchens, and narrow alleyways. These conversations were tentative at first, small expressions of frustration, fleeting fantasies of retaliation. But as months passed, and as the stark contrast between their suffering and the nobles' excess became ever more glaring, the ideas hardened. What had begun as private anger grew into shared determination. A plan began to emerge, not fully formed, but undeniable in its intent. A reckoning for the injustice endured, a night in which the invisible might finally assert their power over the untouchable. The conspirators were ordinary people, yet the weight of oppression had transformed them into individuals capable of extraordinary audacity. They were cooks, maids, stable hands, and valets, faces that could disappear into the background of a crowded ballroom, hands that could handle knives and firewood alike, minds sharp with observation and memory. They knew the routines of the households intimately, which doors were bolted, which servants could be trusted, which nobles slept lightly, and which were oblivious to danger. This knowledge became the foundation of their plotting. Every detail mattered: the timing of patrols, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of candles and chandeliers. Each small advantage was considered, rehearsed in thought and whispered dialogue, until the plan began to take shape in the minds of those who had long been powerless. Psychology played a central role in their plotting. The conspirators were aware of their own moral boundaries, the thin line between justice and atrocity. Some wrestled with conscience, wondering if they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Others embraced the darkness fully, driven by a mixture of rage and desperation that overrode fear or hesitation. Conversations among them were often fraught with tension, debates over methods, questions of loyalty, and the terrifying acknowledgement that once set in motion, there could be no retreat. In these exchanges, the human mind's capacity for rationalization became evident. The massacre was justified in their eyes not as murder, but as repayment, as the inevitable correction of a world that had long been tilted against them. Each participant convinced themselves, in some quiet, private way, that history would understand their actions, even if the city itself could not. Carnival offered the perfect cover. The chaos of the festival, the masks, the constant movement of people through the streets and halls provided anonymity. The nobles would be distracted, their attention absorbed in music, dance, and wine. Every reveler was a potential shield, a moving obstacle that could conceal the servant's approach. The plan relied on this environment, timing every action to coincide with the height of celebration, using the noise and visual distraction to mask the sounds of intrusion. Every alley, every corridor, every staircase became a potential path to execution. The conspirators memorized the layout of each mansion they targeted, imagining themselves in each room, plotting every step with meticulous care. It was a plan born not only of anger but of intelligence and patience, a calculated orchestration of violence masked beneath the guise of festivity. The weapons were chosen with equal care. Knives, axes, and blunt implements were hidden away in places where the masters would never suspect them. Fire was considered, briefly, then abandoned for its unpredictability. The conspirators knew that precision, not chaos, would ensure the success of their plan. Each tool was inspected, weighed, and imagined in action. There was a grim pride in this preparation, a ritualistic aspect to the careful assembly of instruments that would turn their private rage into tangible, deadly power. The act of preparation itself was intoxicating, a psychological thrill that blended anticipation, fear, and an almost religious sense of purpose. Trust became a currency more valuable than any coin. Within the ranks of the conspirators, loyalty was tested repeatedly. One misstep could unravel months of careful planning. Betrayals could expose the group to the full wrath of the law, and hesitation could doom the entire operation. The conspirators learned to read one another, to gauge the subtle signs of doubt or fear. Those who faltered were gently, but firmly, corrected, reinforced by reminders of the stakes. Their unity, fragile yet ironclad, was the invisible scaffolding on which the entire massacre would ultimately depend. It was a bond forged in oppression and nurtured in secrecy, a network of minds synchronized in dark purpose. In these final weeks before the night of the massacre, the city of Lyon remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering within its walls. The nobles continued their indulgent preparations, decorating halls, arranging feasts, and rehearsing dances, entirely ignorant of the lurking threat. Meanwhile, the servants rehearsed their roles in quiet rooms, walked the corridors silently, and communicated with subtle gestures and whispered warnings. The tension grew with every passing day, a palpable undercurrent beneath the surface of Carnival. Each conspirator knew that once the plan was set into motion, there could be no turning back. What had begun as whispered fantasies of revenge would soon explode into reality, a violent assertion of agency by those long forced into invisibility. By the time the first evening bells rang across Lyon, signaling the start of Carnival, the conspirators were ready. The plans, the weapons, the timing, and the psychological preparation had coalesced into a single, unstoppable purpose. Each servant carried not only their role but the weight of years of suffering, humiliation, and silent fury. The night would demand courage, precision, and a ruthless embrace of their darkest impulses. The Midnight Massacre had been born in whispers, nurtured in secret, and now, finally, it was poised to descend upon Lyon, a terrifying, unforgettable eruption of revenge that would shatter the city's illusions of safety, privilege, and invincibility. The night had finally arrived. Lyon's streets were alive with the colors and chaos of Carnival, lanterns flickering in the wind, music spilling from open windows, and laughter echoing off the ancient stone buildings. Masks concealed faces and intentions alike, allowing the nobles to move freely through the throngs without fear, yet it was precisely this distraction that the servants had been waiting for. Every sound of celebration, every burst of laughter, every footstep of a reveler became a shield, a cover under which the dark plan could take shape. The city, so full of life and joy, had no idea that within the very houses they celebrated, horror was about to be unleashed. Inside the first mansion, the servants moved like shadows. They had memorized the layout perfectly: the narrow corridors, the spiral staircases, the hidden rooms behind false walls. Every step was calculated, every heartbeat measured. The nobles, intoxicated with wine and excitement, did not notice the slight creak of floorboards that had been subtly weakened in preparation, or the faint whisper of movement behind closed doors. The conspirators struck with quiet precision, entering rooms where their masters slept or entertained guests. Fear had been tempered by months of planning, and hesitation could mean failure. Yet in that silence before the attack, an almost surreal calm hung in the air, a tension that made each breath feel like the prelude to a storm. When the first blows fell, the illusion of celebration shattered. The clatter of furniture, the screams of the startled nobles, the sudden panic of those awakened in the middle of revelry pierced the festive air. Chaos erupted within the grand halls. Candlelight flickered across terrified faces, reflecting wide eyes and gaping mouths. The masquerade of wealth and refinement, the carefully constructed image of power, dissolved in an instant. The servants moved methodically, targeting those who had oppressed them, striking with a combination of rage and precision that left no doubt about their intent. The contrast between the joyous noise of Carnival outside and the screams echoing through the opulent corridors inside could not have been more stark. Some nobles tried to flee, stumbling over carpets and furniture, only to be intercepted by figures they had long considered invisible. The servants knew every hiding place, every passage, every weak point. Doors that were supposed to be locked could be opened. Windows that were thought secure could be forced. The fear of the victims was compounded by disbelief. How could those they had ignored, belittled, and humiliated rise so suddenly and with such deadly effectiveness? The element of surprise magnified the terror, transforming it from mere violence into psychological devastation. Each scream, each desperate plea, each futile attempt at resistance fueled the conspirators, solidifying the transformation from oppressed to avenger. Outside, the music and laughter continued, almost mocking in its obliviousness. Masked dancers twirled, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just steps away. The contrast between the public spectacle and the private terror created a surreal, almost cinematic quality to the events. Shadows moved across walls and ceilings, blending with the dim candlelight, creating forms that were terrifying yet eerily beautiful in their choreography of vengeance. Each servant played a role, executing the plan with a grim synchronicity honed through months of preparation. There was no room for error. Hesitation could cost lives, both of the conspirators and of those they sought to punish. The massacre was not indiscriminate. The servants targeted specific individuals whose cruelty had left the deepest scars, whose arrogance had fueled years of resentment. Yet, in the heat of the moment, the violence sometimes spilled over, touching those who had not personally wronged anyone but were part of the household they served. Fear, anger, and adrenaline intertwined, creating a chaotic tapestry of horror. The victims' cries mingled with the distant echoes of carnival music, a juxtaposition that made the night feel almost unreal. In that darkness, morality blurred. Right and wrong became irrelevant as the primal need for survival and revenge dictated every action. Some servants hesitated, caught between loyalty to one another and the shocking reality of what they had chosen to do. But the collective force of months of planning and shared suffering pushed them forward. Every room cleared, every noble subdued, every scream silenced was both a step toward freedom and a descent into darkness. The psychological weight of the act was enormous, yet the immediacy of execution left no room for reflection. Each conspirator became both instrument and witness to a transformation in the social order that, however temporary, had never before been seen in Lyon. By the early hours of the morning, the massacre had left an indelible mark. The halls were strewn with the remnants of opulence and life. Overturned chairs, shattered glasses, blood-stained floors, and terrified survivors in shock. The servants, having executed their plan with both precision and fury, retreated into the shadows from which they had emerged. Their actions were complete, yet the consequences were only beginning. The city itself, oblivious as it had been to the undercurrents of tension, would soon awaken to a scene of unparalleled horror, its collective innocence destroyed. The Carnival, once a symbol of joy and indulgence, had become a night of reckoning, a dark mirror reflecting the consequences of years of oppression and hidden rage. In the aftermath, the streets of Lyon remained alive with celebration, but within the walls of its grand houses, silence, shock, and grief prevailed. The night had turned Carnival into a theater of blood, a stark and brutal illustration of the fragility of power and the hidden potential of the oppressed. The Midnight Massacre had begun in whispers, but by its conclusion, it had rewritten the story of the city, leaving a legacy that would be remembered for generations. A night when masks hid not only faces, but the true face of vengeance itself. Dawn broke over Lyon like a fragile promise, but the city that awoke was not the same as the one that had danced through the night. As the first light touched the streets, the echoes of the Midnight Massacre began to spread. Word traveled quickly through whispers and terrified neighbors. Something unthinkable had occurred in the grand houses of the city. Windows and doors bore marks of forced entry. The once pristine halls were shattered, and the lifeless bodies of nobles, those who had seemed untouchable, lay strewn in grotesque tableaus of violence. Panic rippled through the population, the shock magnified by the contrast between the night's public celebration and the private devastation that now confronted every observer. Lyon's citizens, accustomed to social order and the unquestioned power of their elite, struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. Authorities were summoned in haste, their arrival marked by a tense mixture of curiosity, dread, and procedural urgency. The city's guards and magistrates found themselves facing a scene of unparalleled chaos. Rooms were overturned, valuables looted or scattered, and the physical evidence of struggle was everywhere. Yet the most terrifying aspect was not simply the carnage, but the audacity with which it had been carried out. Servants, those who had lived quietly in the margins of privilege, had not only struck boldly but with calculated precision, leaving few traces of error. It was an unprecedented challenge to investigate a crime committed within the very walls of the city's power by those whose knowledge of domestic routines gave them a near-perfect advantage. The social shock was immediate. Families who had prided themselves on their security, their control, and their status realized that vulnerability had always existed where they had never thought to look. Nobles who had dismissed servants as invisible now confronted the reality that these very people possessed both motive and means to carry out unspeakable acts. The city's hierarchy, once assumed unbreakable, was shaken to its core. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Tales of betrayal, revenge, and long-suppressed anger circulated, adding to the atmosphere of fear. Even those untouched by the massacre felt the tremors of its implications, questioning the loyalty of their own households, the safety of their possessions, and the solidity of the social order they had relied upon for generations. Interrogations began, conducted with a mixture of rigor and terror. Servants were questioned, accused, and sometimes tortured for information. Many remained silent, bound by fear, loyalty, or a grim sense of shared responsibility. Yet over time, cracks appeared. Confessions emerged, not only revealing the identities of the conspirators, but also offering insight into the psychological and social pressures that had led to such extreme measures. The testimonies were chilling. Years of humiliation, exploitation, and deprivation culminated in a deliberate, methodical plan for vengeance. The authorities, while seeking justice, could not ignore the context that had birthed such violence. For the first time, the human stories behind the act, anger, desperation, and the desire for retribution, were laid bare before a city still trying to grasp the enormity of the crime. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Nobles who had escaped the massacre, or who witnessed the events from adjacent houses, were left in states of shock, haunted by the faces of those they had considered subservient. The disparity between past interactions and present reality created a dissonance that many struggled to reconcile. Fear became a pervasive element of daily life. Trust in servants, once absolute, eroded completely. Households were fortified, doors bolted more securely, and servants scrutinized with suspicion and dread. The massacre transformed the city's social fabric overnight, leaving invisible wounds alongside the very visible scars of violence. Economically, the impact was significant as well. Estates were disrupted, trade between households slowed, and the maintenance of social order demanded resources previously allocated to indulgence and pleasure. Servants, whether implicated or merely under suspicion, faced harsher scrutiny and stricter control. The balance of labor and leisure, already delicate, shifted dramatically as nobles sought to reclaim dominance while ensuring that no similar uprising could occur. Lyon, which had been a city of celebration and display, now experienced a heightened awareness of vulnerability and mortality. The massacre became a lesson in the fragility of wealth and the latent dangers that lay hidden in the familiar domestic sphere. Socially, the city wrestled with a complex mix of outrage, sympathy, and fear. Some voices, quietly and cautiously, recognized the deep injustices suffered by the servants, acknowledging that systemic cruelty had contributed to the eruption of violence. Others, particularly among the elite, focused solely on punishment and restoration of order. Public sentiment was a volatile mixture, with gossip and rumor fueling anxiety, while debates over morality, justice, and culpability simmered in hushed conversations in taverns, markets, and private salons. The Midnight Massacre forced Lyon to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, the consequences of oppression, and the unpredictable potential for retaliation from those long ignored. By the time the initial investigations concluded, Lyon had been irrevocably altered. The city would carry the scars of the massacre long after the immediate events faded from daily attention. The combination of psychological trauma, social upheaval, and legal reckoning created a legacy that extended far beyond the physical violence of the night itself. Survivors and perpetrators alike were left with an indelible mark, and the city's memory became inseparable from the horror that had unfolded during what had begun as a time of joy and celebration. The Midnight Massacre had not only destroyed lives, but also transformed the collective consciousness of Lyon, ensuring that the shadow of that night would linger, haunting the city and shaping its future for decades to come. The Midnight Massacre of Lyon was not simply an eruption of violence. It was the culmination of years of oppression, resentment, and psychological pressure that had silently festered within the hidden corners of noble households. The servants who carried out the attacks were ordinary people by appearance, yet the weight of enduring cruelty had transformed their minds, forging a combination of cunning, patience, and ruthlessness that few could have predicted. To understand their actions, one must delve into the twisted logic of survival and vengeance, the moral inversion that occurs when humans are pushed to the edge of desperation, and the unique circumstances that allowed fantasy to become deadly reality. Decades of systemic oppression had created a psychological landscape ripe for rebellion. Servants lived in a constant state of anticipation, perpetually aware that a minor mistake could trigger humiliation, punishment, or even expulsion from their homes. Over time, the cumulative effect of these small indignities produced a simmering anger, a low-grade fury that percolated beneath the surface of daily obedience. Each insult, each act of disregard, was internalized and reframed in the mind as evidence of a universe tilted unfairly. This persistent psychological pressure created an environment in which the idea of retaliation, once unthinkable, became increasingly appealing. In the servants' imagination, vengeance was not merely revenge. It was justice, the correction of a world that had long denied them dignity and respect. The psychological transformation was also aided by the nature of the work itself. Servants possessed intimate knowledge of the households they served, the schedules of their masters, the layout of the buildings, the vulnerabilities and security, and the hidden habits that marked each noble's behavior. This familiarity bred a dangerous combination of confidence and imagination. They had long lived in the shadows, unseen and underestimated. Yet now they recognized that the very invisibility that had kept them powerless could become a weapon. The human mind, when coupled with detailed knowledge and the motivation of anger, began to conceive of strategies and scenarios that were methodical, precise, and chillingly effective. The massacre was the logical, though extreme, manifestation of this cognitive process. Moral reasoning, for these individuals, became a fluid concept. What the outside world would label murder was framed internally as retribution, the balancing of scales long skewed by privilege and cruelty. Each participant in the plot had likely wrestled with guilt and hesitation in private, but the collective force of shared suffering and mutual reinforcement provided a psychological shield. When surrounded by conspirators who echoed their thoughts, validated their resentment, and confirmed the righteousness of their intent, the servants were able to suppress hesitation and doubt. Their minds were trained on one objective: exact revenge in a manner that would assert both control and power, transforming years of oppression into a night of decisive action. Historical context deepened these psychological motivations. Lyon, like much of Europe in this period, was governed by strict hierarchies, rigid class systems, and deeply entrenched social norms. Mobility was minimal, opportunity scarce, and defiance dangerous. For the servants, rebellion in ordinary circumstances would have been suicidal, yet the chaos of Carnival provided a rare and almost miraculous cover. The convergence of social disorder, anonymity behind masks, and the psychological readiness to act created a perfect storm. What might have seemed improbable or irrational in normal conditions became not only possible, but likely. The human mind, under the influence of injustice and opportunity, began to envision what the body could accomplish in secrecy and with precision. Psychologically, the massacre can also be understood as a form of catharsis. Years of subjugation, humiliation, and invisibility generated a pressure that demanded release. Violence became both metaphorical and literal, a way to reclaim dignity, to assert self-worth, and to demonstrate the capacity for agency that had been denied for so long. The planning itself served as a rehearsal of empowerment, and the act of execution transformed fantasy into tangible reality. This intersection of psychology and circumstance, oppression, opportunity, and calculated revenge, created a scenario in which ordinary individuals committed extraordinary acts of violence without hesitation once the moment arrived. Yet there was also an element of moral ambiguity. While the servants were undeniably perpetrators of horrific acts, they were simultaneously victims of a system that had stripped them of autonomy, forced obedience, and denied basic human respect. The massacre was born not from innate cruelty, but from a cumulative history of suffering and indignity. Understanding this does not excuse the acts themselves, but it provides a lens to comprehend how humans respond under extreme duress. History is littered with examples of the oppressed striking back at the powerful in ways that shock society, demonstrating the fragile balance between control and chaos, order and revenge. In this light, the Midnight Massacre was as much a study of human psychology as it was a criminal event. It highlighted the devastating effects of systemic abuse, the capacity for ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary acts when pushed to the brink, and the moral complexity inherent in acts of revenge. The servants' minds were shaped by years of oppression, fueled by acute awareness of injustice, and sharpened by intimate knowledge of their targets. In the end, their actions were a chilling combination of intellect, emotion, and circumstance, a dark reminder that the human psyche, when molded by cruelty and opportunity, can produce consequences that echo far beyond the night in which they occur. The massacre, in its brutality and precision, revealed uncomfortable truths about society, power, and human behavior. It was not merely an event, but a psychological phenomenon, a convergence of circumstance, motive, and cognition that forever changed the city of Lyon and left historians grappling with questions about morality, justice, and the hidden depths of human anger. The Midnight Massacre became a testament to the dangerous potential of suppressed fury, the peril of unchecked privilege, and the terrifying power of ordinary individuals pushed to extraordinary extremes. The Midnight Massacre of Lyon did not end with the sunrise of that fateful day. Its reverberations echoed across the city, weaving into the very fabric of Lyonese society, leaving a scar that would linger for generations. The events of that night became more than a mere crime. They became a story whispered in hushed tones, passed from servant to servant, noble to noble, and eventually, recorded in chronicles that sought to make sense of the horror. The city, once bustling with light, commerce, and confidence in its rigid social hierarchies, now carried the weight of paranoia and uncertainty. Those who had survived the night looked at their homes, their servants, and their neighbors differently, with a newfound understanding that appearances could be deceptive and that even the invisible might harbor extraordinary and terrifying power. The massacre disrupted not only the immediate social order, but also the cultural perception of class and authority. Nobles who had once taken their privilege for granted were forced to confront the fragility of their positions. Trust, once implicit in the master-servant relationship, became a scarce commodity. Households instituted stricter oversight, scrutinizing even the smallest behaviors of those in service. Doors were reinforced, keys counted, and servants observed with an intensity born of fear. What had previously been a largely invisible relationship of power and obedience was now laid bare in stark, uncompromising terms. The oppressed, if pushed too far, could strike back with devastating consequences. This realization haunted the city and became a lesson in vigilance and caution that extended well beyond Lyon itself. The legacy of the massacre also transformed the collective psychology of the survivors. Families who had lost members carried with them trauma that could not easily be reconciled. The memory of screams, overturned furniture, and the sight of blood in opulent halls remained imprinted on the minds of witnesses, shaping their perceptions of safety, loyalty, and human nature. Fear mingled with grief, producing an enduring emotional scar that outlasted the immediate aftermath. In some ways, the massacre exposed the vulnerability that wealth and privilege could not shield against, challenging assumptions about power and invincibility. Even those who escaped unscathed could never again view their world with the same innocence, as the line between control and chaos had been irrevocably blurred. Historically, the Midnight Massacre became a cautionary tale. Chroniclers and historians later reflected on it not merely as an act of violence, but as a case study in social tension, oppression, and the psychology of revenge. It served as a stark reminder that systemic cruelty and neglect of human dignity carry consequences beyond the obvious, and that those forced into silence and invisibility may one day assert their agency in ways society cannot anticipate. The massacre was a violent punctuation mark in Lyon's history, forcing both contemporaries and future generations to acknowledge the latent dangers embedded within rigid hierarchies. Its story became part of the city's folklore, a narrative that blended historical record with legend, warning listeners of the potential for revenge born from years of accumulated suffering. The cultural and moral questions raised by the massacre were equally profound. Were the servants mere criminals, or victims acting within a perverse framework of justice? Could a society that allowed such inequities ever hope to prevent similar events in the future? These questions haunted legal scholars, ethicists, and storytellers alike. The massacre forced a re-evaluation of the boundaries of morality, challenging the notion that only the law defined right and wrong. The servants' actions were morally repugnant in their brutality, yet they were rooted in years of systemic abuse, raising difficult questions about culpability, justice, and the social conditions that can drive ordinary people to extraordinary violence. Even decades after the event, the massacre retained a psychological hold over Lyon. Tales of the night were told with a mixture of horror and awe. The names of the houses, the streets, and even some of the surviving participants etched into memory. The carnival, once a symbol of joy and indulgence, was forever shadowed by the knowledge that festivity could mask terror, that even celebration could conceal danger. Families approached festivals and gatherings with caution, wary of disruption, rebellion, or the hidden resentments of those considered inferior. In this way, the legacy of the massacre extended beyond immediate tragedy. It reshaped culture, social behavior, and the collective consciousness of the city itself. On a broader level, the Midnight Massacre of Lyon became a symbol of human resilience and human destructiveness intertwined. It revealed the capacity for ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary acts when pushed to the brink, and the consequences of ignoring systemic inequities for too long. The massacre was both an end and a beginning. An end to the unquestioned dominance of the city's elite, and a beginning of a more cautious, reflective awareness of power, oppression, and the potential for vengeance. In every retelling, it carried with it a warning. The consequences of cruelty are rarely confined to the immediate moment, and even the most invisible and overlooked individuals may harbor the capacity for action that shatters expectations and upends entire social orders. Ultimately, the Midnight Massacre left Lyon a city transformed, haunted by the night when masks concealed not only faces but also intentions, a night when the invisible struck with lethal precision. Its legacy was etched into the physical, social, and psychological landscape of the city, ensuring that long after the blood had dried and the carnival music had faded, the shadow of that night would remain. Lyon would remember, and the story would endure, a dark testament to the consequences of oppression, the fragility of privilege, and the terrifying power that lies hidden in the human heart when anger, injustice, and opportunity converge in perfect, deadly alignment.